Hi everyone. My name's Luke Fontaine Richardson. I'm joined today by Caden Lee and Brennan Carlson. So, we're members of Realize Radicalization, a student-led organization that focuses on educating the public on the topic of radicalization and extremism. On today's episode of Get Real, our podcast where we interview a variety of experts in the field of radicalization and extremism, we are joined by David Jones. David Jones received his BA in political science and MA in political science from the University of Alberta, during which time his coursework was centered around the topics of radicalization and security. He was also the recipient of a Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada graduate scholarship by the University in Ottawa, I don't know why, Carleton University, which enabled him to further develop an assessment framework for programs that were attempting to counteract violent extremism. Throughout his professional career, Jones has had extensive experience researching radicalization and terrorism. So he worked as a research intern for Valens Global, a firm that focuses on researching and preventing acts of violence by non-state actors. And he was involved in a Canadian network for research on terrorism, security, and society, also known as TSIS, funded project to uncover the causes of radicalization among Islamic converts. So he still acts as a junior research affiliate there. So currently he is the manager of applied research at the Organization for the Prevention of Violence, which is a non-governmental organization that studies and develops strategies alongside different stakeholders to prevent hate-motivated and extremist violence within Canada. So additionally, he's been funded by Public Safety Canada, TSIS, NATO, and the Department of National Defense. He's been published in outlets such as the Globe and Mail, and he's lectured for the likes of the Brookings Institute, Oxford University's Department of Politics and Canadian Joint Operations Command, the United Nations Safe Cities Initiatives, and the RCMP's Counter-Terrorism Information Officer course. So he has a wide range of research interests, particularly the relationship between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda and far-right extremism on the internet. So we at Realize Radicalization are delighted that you took the time out of your busy schedule to meet with us, and we can't wait to spend the next hour or so learning more about what you do. So without further ado, let's start. So David, can you give us a small background of your kind of intellectual biography and your work with OPV? Kind of what led you to begin researching this topic in the first place, and what are your main research interests within the field, in case I missed any?
Sure, great. No, thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So I guess I'm kind of unique at the OPV insofar as a lot of my coworkers have these really cool, very personal stories about how they became, interested in violent extremism. So our executive director, sort of some family in Northern Ireland, visited the country during the Troubles. One of my coworkers was in Brussels when a bomb went off. Brad Galloway, who I think you might have talked to at one point in time, had some personal experience involved in the far right. Unlike all of them, I don't really have an interesting origin story. I guess maybe if you wanted to paint my trajectory into working on violent extremism in the sort of most coherent light, you might say that I've always been interested in what some people call wicked problems. These are kind of problems with a bunch of inputs that kind of get all wrapped together and are tough to disentangle. And so I think in some ways, radicalization is definitely a perfect example of that. But prior to kind of working in violent extremism or researching violent extremism, I spent time working on, environmental regulation and energy policy for the provincial government in Alberta, which is kind of its own wicked problem. And so I think, you in your very kind bio of me covered most of my current research. But so a little bit of work on sort of the sociology of religion and what that might be able to tell us about radicalization to violence. And then at present, as the threat environment has changed a little bit, spending a little bit more time now looking at right-wing extremism and anti-authority extremism.
You have done a lot. Sorry, I seem to have missed a lot of that in the intro. But so kind of with your kind of work that you do with the OPV, so are there any intervention strategies, not to paint too broad of a brush, but any strategies that you found have been the most effective, if you can even say that?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about countering violent extremism in general, we tend to think about it using kind of a public health framework has really become the dominant way of understanding it. And so public health interventions tend to get categorized as being at either that primary level secondary level, or tertiary level. So primary intervention is really focused on, in the public health, I guess, domain. It's looking at how do we prevent the emergence of a problem in society. That's smoking. What do we do to, in elementary school, before kids, even get their hands on a cigarette? How do we try to prevent them from becoming interested in smoking in the first place? The secondary level, it's how do you get people, once they maybe had that first cigarette, to not get addicted to smoking. And in the tertiary level, it's once you have, COPD, what can we do to kind of mitigate the effects of that and get you to stop smoking? When we're talking about violent extremism in the primary space, we tend to be thinking about how do we prevent the emergence of radicalization in the society in general. And now that's a really attractive place to work in, because it would be awesome if we could prevent people from ever, journeying down the path to involvement in violent extremism. But of course, as we all kind of who are interested in radicalization know, we actually don't have a lot of clarity on what actually causes people to engage in violence. We know that path looks very different for everyone. And so while there's still some worthwhile efforts in that primary space, a lot of programs, and certainly at the OPV, we've instead decided to focus more on that secondary and the tertiary space. And so when we're working in violent extremism or prevention of violent extremism, that secondary space means once people have started to demonstrate some behavioral indicators of radicalization to violence, so maybe they're going to some trainings offered by some right-wing groups, et cetera, or at the tertiary level, once they've already engaged in criminal behavior in the interest in order to advance the cause of an extremist group, how do we get them out of that movement? And so I think when we're talking about intervention in the secondary space or in the tertiary space, it often looks a lot like other types of programming that are offered in kind of analogous areas of practice. So oftentimes we look, perhaps to what gang prevention or gang intervention programs are doing for some inspiration. And really at the core, it kind of comes down to really, I'd say probably the most important thing is being able to establish a really strong relationship with the person that you're trying to help, have them feel that they can trust you. And almost of equal importance is have them feel like you understand what they're going through and understand what they're talking about. So, because extremism is fundamentally an ideological phenomena, what we found to be really important is, married with traditional social work or with traditional kind of therapeutic or psychological approaches to helping people, it's having staff and having practitioners who have a little bit of understanding in the ideology, so the person they're working with doesn't feel like they're talking to like a brick wall that has absolutely no idea what they're talking about.
For the formation of the OPV, was it sort of based as a response to the foreign fighter threat that we had with the Canadian extremist travelers leaving Canada to become jihadists, or also a bit of like the increasing right-wing activity that we've seen in North America since 2016 onwards?
Yeah, good question. So it was a little bit of both. To be entirely frank, the main driving force behind it was in 2015. The Liberals promised some funding under something called the Community Resilience Fund if they were elected, to fund this type of PCVE programming that we've seen in other Western countries. And so really, once we knew there was a possibility of some funding out there, we decided to kind of form the organization. And so we didn't really have a specific threat or a specific threat actor in mind. Very much alive to the fact that, at least in Alberta, we've seen kind of a fair share of a variety of ideological movements that can cause or encourage violence active in the province. And so, from the outset, we kind of knew that we would have to deal with a variety of violent actors motivated by a variety of ideologies. And I think that's where a lot of programs are going now, but wasn't always the case with the first generation of intervention programming, where they tended to really focus on only dealing with one type of ideology. A lot of the programs now are recognizing that the drivers of involvement in violent extremism and what that looks like for people are a little bit more complex and complicated than they used to be. And so you kind of have to have a program that isn't overly determined to focus only on one ideology.
It also seems too that the OPV is proactive in terms of getting out and educating the public, and also working with sort of the Edmonton police forces and the city of Edmonton in general. How effective, or I guess how important is it to sort of get the message out across before people become not known, but targeted by these, radical ideologies or these groups looking to exploit their grievances, etc.
Yeah, so I think it's, ultimately the way we kind of like to think about radicalization is that it's a societal issue manifested at the individual level. And so, the human service practitioners that we have working with us, they're always going to be really focused on dealing with that individual level manifestation of what radicalization looks like. But we do think that, appropriate, cautious awareness raising is a helpful means, if only to kind of dispel some myths around radicalization. And ultimately, it's a fundamentally kind of like a black swan event. So it's a very low probability, but very high impact when somebody, radicalizes to violence and then even goes beyond that and engages in violence themselves. But we do think that, having 1,000 people in the community who are at least in the back of their mind, kind of have a little bit of an idea of what kind of behavioral change to, watch out for, what kind of language should be concerning. That's going to be more effective and more, I guess, acceptable than a massively expanded surveillance state, or just us out in the wilderness trying to find people by ourselves.
I think the other question I have, which would be sort of the Alberta focused, or continuing sort of the Alberta focus. So in 2015, I believe the majority of CETs left Calgary. I could be wrong on that, but there was a fair number of traveling jihadists who left from Alberta. But then also Alberta is kind of known within Canada as being a hotbed, if I say, of right-wing activity. So why is that? Like, what are the dynamics that sort of put Alberta in this position?
Good question. So as an Albertan, I have to first of all get my hackles up and say we're no different than the rest of Canada. But we do seem to have a little bit of, disproportionate presence of some types of extremist groups. I also know, anti-authority extremism has a really long history in Alberta. But I think there are a few things that serve to explain both why we saw a disproportionate number of high-risk travelers leave Canada to Syria or Iraq in that, that 2012, 2015 period for Syria and Iraq. And before that, 2008, 2012 to Somalia to join al-Shabaab as well. So I think partially, it's a combination of a few things. So obviously, Alberta's political culture maybe a little bit more amenable to some, aspects or some overtones of, kind of classic right-wing thought. And so obviously in a province that's kind of disproportionately conservative, it's because the base rate is higher. It's perhaps unsurprising that we'd see, more kind of like white supremacist types. But I think also that's partially a function of geography. And so a lot of, the history of white supremacy in the United States, and this we can maybe come back a little bit to talking about what this transnational dimension looks like now. But historically, in Western Canada, in the Northwestern United States, there was this very, sustained transnational movement of activists and ideas across the Canada-U.S. border. Places like Montana, Idaho, Eastern Washington State, very kind of classic white supremacist hotspots in American history. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that some of those people sort of diffused north into Alberta. And then at the same time that Albertans who were interested in it, went down to the States, refined the ideology, maybe got some money, made some connections, and then came back and kind of propagated it up into Canada. Turning now to the sort of ISIS Al-Qaeda phenomena, I think there are a couple of things driving there. The going to travel and going to fight abroad is very much a young person's game, as is extremism in general. And so I think across all types, the fact that Alberta is the youngest province in Canada, it's perhaps unsurprising that we do see a slightly higher incidence rate, just because this tends to be something young people do. And then, I think there is a risk in placing too much emphasis on the kind of disproportionate number of people who left from Calgary, if only because they were such a small friend group that, if you exclude the people who left from kind of this cluster of guys who were centered around the 8th and 8th Mosque in Calgary, Calgary's numbers don't look all that spectacular or all that different. And so I think a broader point, and there's some really good researchers in the UK that are looking at this, but it's very interesting how you can almost draw a small boundary around a street or around a neighborhood that accounts for a disproportionate number of travelers from cities in the UK, cities in Europe, cities in Canada. And so I think there always is, that friendship and kin influence on, I guess, kind of facilitating involvement in extremism. And so I think some of the picture in Alberta is very much a story of, friends, or in Edmonton of cousins all deciding to do this thing together, kind of the great adventure with your buddies, but manifested in a very bad way.
So kind of on the same, not to like pick too much on Alberta, but like I saw, like I was looking online and I saw you guys had released, your organization had released a report kind of on the rise of hate crimes. And it was something you mentioned a bit earlier too. So the report mentioned the increase of like anti-authority, basically sentiment, which is something we've also seen throughout like this whole entire pandemic, right? So much distrust of government. So kind of with going with that, so do you think these kind of like sentiments lead necessarily to violent extremism? And is there any ways, do you think, to promote reconciliation within these people who feel such a distrust of government and the governments themselves? Or do you think that's kind of an impossible feat?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that merely having a dislike of the government is definitely not, predictive or necessarily will result in violence. Anti-authority extremism in general is kind of an interesting category of extremism because, the government of Canada has recently started using this new terminology to describe the various extremist movements that we see in Canada. So you have politically motivated, religiously motivated, and then ideologically motivated. And then you kind of have four subcategories underneath the ideologically motivated, one of which is anti-authority extremism. And it's sort of the catch-all bucket for the catch-all bucket that doesn't fit anywhere nicely. So, even before the pandemic, there were a lot of reasons to look at the government if you were of that persuasion and, see tyranny, see overreach, see the government, preventing you from doing things you thought you should be allowed to do, or, just kind of impeding on your day-to-day life. And so I think that COVID has perhaps accelerated that a little bit. I don't know what the picture looks like in Manitoba, but I know in Alberta, we've seen a large number of these kind of anti-lockdown, anti-mask protests, that kind of thing. And, at these protests, we've seen kind of some of the sort of the usual suspects from kind of some local hate groups sort of popping up on the margins. Not that everybody at these protests is a part of a hate group or that kind of thing, but definitely trying to co-opt some of these frustrations, which I think we should be sympathetic to on some level, for more kind of malevolent ends. And so I think trying to see what happens to this sort of broad, very frustrated, very animated movement after COVID, hopefully, God willing, comes to an end soon, is something to monitor. But there are a lot of people who are expressing frustrations, for reasons that I'm sympathetic to, or at least, I understand why they're frustrated. And I do think, sort of to your point about reconciliation, we often have a tendency, I think this holds true across movements, to paint movements with a very broad brush. And so I think, that we should always be careful when we're talking about kind of links between, grievances or radical movements and their link to violence. We should be very careful about using that broad brush. And then that's why I think the question about kind of reconciliation between people very frustrated by what the government's done over the last year, or what various provincial governments have done over the last year, and the government themselves is a super interesting question, and one that I can't answer, and so I'll cleverly punt on by saying that at the OPV we primarily work with individuals, so I can't answer that societal question. But obviously, if somebody were to come into our program with those type of grievances, it would be a matter of working through with a social worker, working through with a therapist. Maybe better ways to express that, other than going to a protest and perhaps blaming restrictions on a globalist conspiracy, et cetera, et cetera. So, question so good I couldn't answer it.
I'm kind of curious how prevalent sort of the anti-government, anti-authority movement would be in Canada, because I frankly had no knowledge of it until COVID, right? And we're seeing these people come out and protest, and obviously you have the interconnectedness between the anti-authority groups and then, like you stated, sort of the more extreme, perhaps ideologically motivated people. But has the anti-authority movement in Canada sort of always been here, or is it something that's been sort of heavily taken from and influenced by the movements in the United States within, let's say, the past 10 years?
Yeah, so it's And this is part of the struggle with anti-authority extremism, is particularly when it turns to violence. It often tends to be in the context of an interaction between the person and, a symbol of state power, most usually law enforcement. And so I think that this is kind of a project that we've had on the back burner for so long, I almost can't say we're working on it anymore. But going back through kind of historical records of law enforcement officers killed in line of duty, and not with a lot of them, but with a surprising number of them, if you kind of start to peel back the layers a little bit, you can see this very kind of vague, poorly articulated, but present, grievance or perhaps ideological, obsession with the government. And so it's tough because, often if a law enforcement officer is killed in a confrontation with a person, we tend to only focus on that day, and maybe we don't look back. But I think with anti-authority extremism, what's kind of interesting is to look back at that person's history, and you do often start to see this steady, articulation of grievances. Maybe everybody in the community, knew that wasn't the home you went to because, they had all these crazy signs about the government out front. So I think that anti-authority extremism is really something that we have tended to undercount, partially because it's a movement that's so diffuse and is almost more grievance-based than ideologically driven. So, there isn't a leader per se. Now, when some of the kind of sovereign citizen beliefs made their way up into Canada in, the early 2000s, and then we saw the Canadian spin on that called the Freemen on the Land, we did start to see a little bit more organization, and it made categorization a little bit easier. And, so we can start to put some numbers, maybe a couple thousand, 1,500 to 2,500, kind of these freemen that were kind of a, distinct group, but they kind of faded away over time. Some of them maybe kept the grievance, but lost the ideology. So I think actually this is kind of my personal axe to grind. I think anti-authority extremism is something that's both really under-theorized because we can't quite categorize it effectively yet, and undercounted because it's often, there's no flag or there's no manifesto, but there might be an ideology or grievance that looks a lot like, white supremacy, looks a lot like, jihadism in terms of how it affects the person's worldview, just a lot harder to tease out.
So I kind of think one thing that comes to mind if I think of anti-authority government or violence in Canada would be the Justin Bohr case in Moncton. I think that was in 2015. And I know at the time, at least to what I'm aware of, there didn't seem to be any connection between that anti-authority movement and also his violence. It just seemed to be, like you said, a sort of random act that happened on that day. Now, where am I trying to go with this? See, now I confused myself a little, but I guess if we're kind of looking at it through a contemporary sense, right? Like we would absolutely state that would be a sort of an example of anti-authority violence, right? Like the Canadian policing agencies and also maybe researchers would kind of be more cognizant of, this is the final result of where these movements can lead to, right?
Yeah, 100%. And so I think, some historical work on this subject in particular, I think would be very beneficial to the understanding of extremism in Canada, just because if we can sort of look back in history and judge how it's evolved and how it's changed and how it's manifested, theoretically, our analysis moving forward should be a little bit more refined too. But yeah, it really is. Understanding anti-authority extremism really often gets hung up in this very kind of, like even your question, you like stumbled for a second. It's because it's this weird thing that we know looks like extremism, but the ideology and the grievances are often so poorly articulated that we grapple with how to label it and if we should label it at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the other sort of thing that obviously ties into right-wing extremism is sort of understanding the contemporary situation in Canada. So can you kind of paint a picture of what the current situation of is with right-wing activity across Canada? Is it more prevalent? Has it always sort of been this prevalent? It's just more known to us?
So I think it's shifted a little bit in a few kind of important ways. And so I think, first of all, kind of the first, perhaps most notable shift is there's been a bit of resurgence and interest in, I guess, kind of cell or group-based activity and organizing as opposed to, the leaderless resistance model that really, or lone actor attacks that really kind of define the movement for a very long period of time. At least dating back in the States, sort of post Timothy McVeigh, moving forward, really a strong preference for individuals who, kind of supported the neo-Nazi belief system or were white supremacists to go out and engage in violence on their own. And now, so, of course, we see people like Alexandre Bissonnette, who still kind of, very much embodied that lone actor model of violence, that decision to engage in violence on their own with, little to no support from anybody externally. But I think, one thing we have to kind of be cautious of is that in, the same way that we saw a lot of organizing in the States going on with groups like Adamov and Division, going on with the Base, CRRIC Division, all these kind of new, really more organized, more aesthetically appealing, perhaps, white supremacist groups, they all had their Canadian wings or Canadian cells too. And so I think the open question right now that I certainly don't have the answer to is, in the aftermath of a massive number of arrests in the United States in late 2019, moving into the middle of 2020, this kind of re-atomization of the movement. And so I think the big question now is, these Canadian atoms or these Canadian individuals, are they skeptical or cautious of getting involved in organized groups again? So there's a fair number of people kind of in the white supremacist movement who, were pretty convinced that the Base was like a U.S. government psyop. Does that skepticism and that hesitancy to become involved in a group again persist? Or do they decide to go back to a group? So the National Socialist Order, so the sort of successor of Adamov and Division, is now kind of trying to go through the same recruiting period they were going through in 2016, 2017. So do we see individuals get re-involved in groups? Do we see individuals be like, oh, gee, I was really lucky I didn't get arrested that time. I'm going to just kind of disengage from the movement for the time being? Or perhaps most concerningly, do we see them say, hey, I still really have these beliefs. I really don't think the cell-based models for me, too great a chance of detection. I'm going to go and plan some violence on my own. So I think that's really the question that we're trying to answer now. And I guess perhaps a corollary of that is, a lot of the kind of cells in Canada, perhaps with the exception of the Northern Order, which is kind of its own distinct Canadian thing, does the movement to Canada take on any more unique kind of Canadian dimensions? Or is it really going to be, just the kind of the Canadian wing of a UK-based organization or the Canadian wing of a US-based organization? And do those two things matter? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, so just going back to the topic of prevention in the Canadian context, I think, obviously most Canadians wouldn't want to see the occurrence of like a surveillance state or something. But at the same time, I think a lot of Canadians were supportive of the changes from Bill C-59, which gave CSIS the powers to actively disrupt and prevent threats, right? So I wonder, in your opinion, is that a step in the right direction, or should we be really focusing more on community-based preventative strategies rather than prevention from the state level?
That's a good question. So, I mean, I think that, I'll caveat this by saying I'm not a lawyer nor like a legal scholar. So, digging into the minutia of Bill C-59 is something I'm kind of hesitant to do. But I will generally say that a lot of times, there's kind of this tendency to paint it as, a bit of an either or situation. And I think really, we certainly see ourselves as kind of existing along a spectrum of prevention. And, at the very pointy end of prevention, that's the RCMP finding somebody, engaging in criminal activity and going in and arresting them. At the kind of the middle end of prevention, maybe, that's, I think the analogy for some of CSIS threat reduction powers is, the day you want to go meet your buddies and talk about like a white supremacist attack, maybe, your battery doesn't work in your car, your tires don't work. And so, you can't go to the meeting. And then, we're kind of at the softer end of prevention, if you will, where maybe, the fact you can't go to that meeting, maybe, your teacher, your coworker, your friend went to one of our trainings. They say, hey, there's a group that can kind of help you. Maybe you're in not a great place right now in your head or in your life. Why don't you get some help? And so I think, all those agencies have their own role to play, and so I don't think it's necessarily an either or, but I will entirely agree with you that we ought to be cautious whenever there's a desire to sort of expand surveillance powers or expand those type of powers, and we should approach that critically and not just accepting of any curtailment of our rights or anything. But I mean, I do think that the threat disruption powers that were given to the service in Bill C-59 were both needed, and we have we have evidence to believe they're being used responsibly. And I think a kind of general point too is that national security legislation in Canada, partially and thankfully because we don't really have a lot of national security threats in Canada, is often something that we revisit only once every 20, 25 years. And so CSIS trying to use powers that were given to them during the Cold War or in 2001. Obviously, there's a need for update and a need to reflect that a lot of extremism and a lot of national security threats come from the online space now, which was but a twinkle in DARPA's eye, perhaps when CSIS first came into existence.
So kind of like on the topic of like what we were talking about, like counterterrorism by governments and stuff. So I was reading one of your pieces. So you wrote a bit about like military counterterrorism strategies. You wrote it kind of in the American context, but I think it's still relevant to here. So like kind of what is going on with counterterrorism with military right now? Do you think these strategies are effective? And so what direction do you think this should kind of take in the future, counterterrorism wise?
Okay, so I guess turning this is sort of me maybe taking off my OPV hat for a while, because we're very we try to consciously be in that countering violent extremism space, that softer space, away from the kind of harder CT space. But I mean, I think generally, with the mission in Afghanistan having wrapped up now, like I don't know, quite a number of years ago, the Canadian military does not sort of seem particularly interested in getting re-engaged in counterterrorism at all. Obviously CSOR and JTF2, CSOR is definitely deployed to Kuwait and to Iraq as a part of Operation Inherent Resolve. But I think it's going to be a while before we see the kind of regular Canadian military ever take on a kind of counterterrorism or counterinsurgency mission again. As there seems to be a broader shift in interest in both international relations and in kind of the security and defense industry back towards reorienting to kind of great power competition or the kind of gray zone competition. So great power versus China, gray zone versus Russia. And so I think, the counterterrorism, counterinsurgency skills that were, refined and honed in Afghanistan do have a chance of atrophying. But if there's anything that the history of, I don't know, conflict involving NATO powers in the last 30 years has taught us, it seems to be that as much as we don't want to fight counterinsurgencies, we continue to end up getting caught fighting them. I think it's something to kind of pay attention to and not let that stuff atrophy entirely.
I was thinking about this when you referenced the national, I think you said social order or national order social group. I'm unaware of them, but kind of curious about the white supremacist neo-Nazi groups of the 90s. Like I think Volksfront was one. I can't remember if it's correct, but Brad Galloway was a member. But the kind of perspective I gained from him was it was just a lot of people looking for belonging, hanging around, going to rock shows, getting drunk, fighting people, whatever. It wasn't necessarily that the ideology brought them all together, but it was a piece of it. But it seems today when you look at some of these contemporary neo-Nazi groups, specifically the accelerationist groups like Atomwaffen, CRRIC, etc., there's this extreme sort of propensity to violence and to commit terrorist acts. So was that always sort of a feature of the white supremacist neo-Nazi movement of like the 80s, 90s, 2000s? Or is this something that's relatively new? And within that, how do you effectively disengage someone who is a devout follower of, the base or of Atomwaffen when, their ideology just seems so much more nefarious and darker and deeper than perhaps what the contemporary groups of the 90s would have been?
So I think it's always been the case that, the white supremacist movement or right-wing extremist, violent far-right movement There's always kind of, there's differences between groups. There's different views on whether to pursue political ends or violent ends. There's kind of, different approaches to interacting with, mainstream culture. So obviously Volksfront was kind of, very much in that like white power skinhead. But at the same time, you had some of these, like Don Black, for example, is a pretty good example, founder of Stormfront, who was always kind of trying to, at the same time, have these sort of schemes to get white supremacists, into local state houses or into local government in the US. And then you also had, the Order active, which is a very violent, overtly violent neo-Nazi movement, again, kind of active on the West Coast of the United States, so kind of down Washington State to California. So you always kind of have this ecosystem, and there's always going to be groups within the ecosystem who are, more or less violent than each other, share views and work in alliance with each other, and then, more often than not, are often engaged in infighting. So I think it's always, Volksfront, you could maybe think of as equivalent to like, depending on your views on the Proud Boys, like maybe they're like the Proud Boys of the 90s, and the Order is like the Atomoffen division of today. But I think you always have groups who view violence and view the necessity of violence differently, and will kind of pursue, the same or similar goals using different tactics, often informed by the kind of subculture that they come from.
And is this like accelerationist sort of ideal? Is that something that's driven from like the Turner Diaries or from James Mason's Siege? Or is this something that's sort of, I guess, relatively new and just it's a more effective way to these groups to sort of bring about political and social change?
Yeah, so I think it's the accelerationism issue in particular is something I haven't had the chance to dig into as deeply as I would have liked. But I will say that, the original kind of explanation of the benefits of accelerationism, can be found in kind of some of the early Lenin and like early Marxist writings, this idea of heightening the contradictions in society to bring about a social change. And so, I've had this discussion back and forth with some people about just how new accelerationism is, or whether we just kind of have a name for it now. But there's always been, you can look at like Charles Manson and Helter Skelter. There's been this belief that just a few acts at the right place at the right time could kind of bring the whole system crumbling down. And so I think maybe the cultural focus, sort of like the cultural focus in the movement on accelerationism, and kind of the prevalence that phrase in particular is given within the movement is maybe new. But I do think that, insurgents or terrorists are by their very, definition, always going to be a small group trying to make their actions have a broader repercussion and prompt change. And so I think in some ways, and this is very much something I'm grappling with in my mind, the focus seems to be new, but I think there's also a bit of a defensible position that, insurgents or terrorists are always kind of accelerationists, insofar as they're always trying to have, these small acts to destabilize society. And then if you go down the accelerationism rabbit hole a little bit further, you might talk about the coalitional accelerationism, which is the beliefs, this idea that groups with different ideological goals or frames are working together in order to advance accelerationism. But then, of course, that too has very old parallels. So, for example, George Lincoln Rockwell, leader of the American Nazi Party, got down on more than one occasion with the Nation of Islam based around their shared dislike of Jewish Americans. And so, is that coalitional accelerationism in the 60s? Like maybe. So I think it's there to make a bit of an academic point, I think, partially because terrorism studies hasn't really existed as a field per se for a very long time. There's always this tendency to treat, the newest thing as not possibly having any historical parallels. But I do think that if we sit down and we think harder, there's often historical parallels that could be, really insightful to us.
I kind of brought up a point I was thinking about. So I was reading last night that there's actually a lot of linkages that a lot of people are unaware of between jihadist movements and like these far-right neo-Nazi movements too, right? Like, for example, the base is Al-Qaeda in Arabic, and sort of the nature of operating as a cell is something that's prevalent in a lot of these far-right groups. But that's one thing that sort of perplexes me, is that you have an organization or a unit that pledges this ideology that is obviously Islamophobic and anti-minority, yet they venerate these jihadists and these devout sort of Islamists who perpetrate violence against Western society, right? So it's kind of interesting, and it's kind of curious if you came across any, I guess, research pertaining to that link, or even within your work at OPV, if there's a case of an individual in Alberta who might have been kind of swayed to either side of the, I guess, the ideological spectrum.
So in terms of kind of what we've seen, like our work so far, I would say there's a little bit of like ideological instability, but not necessarily, that pronounced a hop from one to the other. But the case I really like to go back to was a guy by the name, I think it's Nicholas Young. And so he was a transit police officer either worked in DC and lived in Virginia or vice versa. But so how did this work? He was arrested and charged with material support because he tried to send like some gift cards to ISIS or something. But like prior to converting to Islam and then becoming a jihadist supporter, he was like a white supremacist. And then when he like prayed, he would sort of still like pray to Hitler sometimes. So kind of, it's very strange. There does seem to be a little bit of growth in this ideological instability. There was an article written by a guy who works with Prevent in some capacity a number of months ago called "We Need to Talk About Kieran." I'll try to share the link with you. It's an interesting listen. But sort of again, this kind of, they're seeing this in Prevent, where particularly as you kind of have younger kids, so in that kind of 15 to 18 range, getting involved, you do see a little bit of fluidity between, having beliefs that you wouldn't think you could square the circle. But when you're young, you can kind of, just make it work. And so there is a little bit more ideological exploration than I think we used to see. And I think in no small part, that's probably due to the fact that just the internet makes it so easy to, explore these different things. But then again, going back and kind of pointing perhaps to some historical parallels to this, the Heritage Front in Canada in the 90s, which was like a white supremacist group, sent their people to get training and some support from Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. So, again, kind of surprising, not what you'd expect. But I think there's just this tendency of extremism to make for strange bedfellows. And so I think that's held true for longer than it hasn't.
Kind of just on like the same topic, you kind of were speaking a bit about ideological flexibility, I guess, in a sense, because people are just drawn to extremism in whatever form, in some cases, like that guy you mentioned. So kind of on that. So like I was reading an article that you were kind of like, I guess, involved in with thesis. It was about like new converts and how vulnerable they are to radicalization. Like not necessarily people who had converted to even a radical form of a religion, but just say a new convert to Islam was more radical, was more prone to radicalization than other people. So like, how do you feel like why is that? Why are new converts so like vulnerable to this kind of thing? And how do you steer somebody who's just gotten into a religion away from the more extreme edges of it?
Great. So actually, I have a paper sort of under review right now. Hopefully, it'll be published somewhere, specifically kind of detailing the outcomes of some of that research. And so I think particularly, I feel like really bad for religious converts to Islam in the post 9/11 era, because like they are like, almost like the most securitized communities in the aftermath of 9/11 and sort of this war on terror. But I do think when we're talking specifically about religious converts who then, later come to get involved with ISIS, come to get involved with Al Qaeda, there's been a lot of poor research and kind of shoddy conclusions drawn about them. And those conclusions have kind of fallen into one of four categories. Either that these are, fundamentally broken people, and so we shouldn't be surprised to become terrorists, which is like just if you pause for a minute, it's a really like horrifying assumption to make about converts. That they are basically converts to terrorism, being that they convert and then rapidly become involved in terrorism. And in Canada, that's not the case at all. So I think of the 28 cases or so that I found, the median time between conversion and involvement was 3.5 years, which is, not an extraordinarily long time, but that's longer than a lot of people have sort of said is the case. I think that's interesting. And then third, that, a lack of religious knowledge is the reason. But if you drill into their biographies and drill into what people said about them, you actually find that, like, maybe that's not the case either. And so I think that the kind of the hypothesis that I start to develop in the paper on converts is that we need to kind of pay a little bit more attention to kind of what happens after conversion, and particularly the sort of emotional and spiritual processes that people go through as they enter a new faith community. And in particular, I seize on this kind of feeling of disappointment that a lot of converts have after they convert, where there's a gap between what they expected their life would be like after they convert and what their life is in fact like. And that, and this is to kind of jump into the rabbit hole a little bit, so my apologies, but that the shape their disappointment takes often resonates quite closely with some of the rhetoric used by groups like ISIS, used by groups like Al-Qaeda, about the sort of, the ostentatiousness of Islam in the West, kind of imams or perhaps, caving to Western governments, because oftentimes converts have this idea of that, that this holy harmonic ummah that they convert into, and in reality, it's often not the case. And so there's this kind of, the way in which their disappointment manifests might have some influence on their openness to the narratives about Western Islam given by groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that might partially explain, perhaps a subsequent openness to radicalization. And I think seizing on this concept in particular of disappointment as a possible precursor to radicalization, there's an article by Pete Simi and some other people looking at military veterans who became involved in the far right. And actually, they also seized on the disappointment that veterans felt after they, came home and didn't receive a hero's welcome, or after they couldn't quite crack it in the unit that they wanted to get into in the military, which was the case with Timothy McVeigh, that disappointment also opened up an avenue to radicalization. So I think that the kind of what I'd like to do next is look a little bit more at the role that disappointment, whether that comes after a conversion or whether that comes after military deployment, might play in explaining radicalization.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually, because then we have the case in Winnipeg of Aaron Driver, of course, who I think it was exactly 3.5 years when he converted to when he committed his act in Ontario. I guess my understanding of it always was that when you're bringing or taking in this new faith, you're more vulnerable to sort of the hardline aspects of it, because you're searching for answers that might not necessarily be answered by the more moderate, or I guess sort of, contemporary senses of it or aspects of it. But there's one thing I always kind of thought about when I compare like jihadism to far right extremism, and it's that at least with jihadism, you have these charismatic leaders, and you have this sort of like existential and this philosophical question and purpose in life you're trying to find, right? Like I understand how people can go down that path, but then in terms of far right extremism, it's just completely contradictory of anything that we're taught in society that makes sense. I mean, these people venerate a man who murdered millions and who their grandparents fought against in the Second World War. So that's always really confused me. So have you sort of come across any understanding of what drive people towards far right extremism, specifically the more, I guess, extreme aspects of it?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think, I would add to sort of, your understanding of jihadism. I think the other thing that, particularly in the Canadian context where, Aaron Driver being an exception because he did carry out an attack at home or tried to carry out an attack at home. But, a lot of the guys that we saw, leaving Canada were going to a conflict where there was a totally justifiable outrage at a dictator. And there were, very real images of thousands of civilians being slaughtered on, a weekly basis. And so kind of the other thing, and the conversion literature or conversion research kind of fits into this a little bit. But I do think that we sometimes, in our understandable and justifiable, revulsion at the acts some of these people do, we suspend for a moment our ability to kind of place ourselves in their perspective and understand that, for the guys who wanted to go fight with ISIS, there was a ton of bad stuff that ISIS was doing, but there was also this narrative that the group itself was promoting, and that, you find some evidence for that they were kind of, the defenders of Sunnis in Iraq and in Syria. And, in some way, for some short period of time, certainly before they took a hard turn in 2013, 2014, that was a little bit true. And so I guess kind of, another axe I have to grind in a way is that the foreign fighters, I think we should understand them as like analytically distinct from homegrown violent extremist people who carry out attacks at home. And I think that's something literature is starting to recognize, but hasn't quite got there yet. Now, turning to the kind of the right-wing extremism space, I'm like 100% on board with you, because like I look at, the story of World War II, and I'm just like, how could anybody want to relive that? And so, I grapple a little bit with being able to put myself in the shoes as well. In some ways, I have an easier time understanding why someone would go to Syria than why someone would want to go in, shoot up a synagogue or shoot up a mosque. But at the same time, I mean, I think to maybe highlight some of the religious aspects of contemporary right-wing extremism, which is often something that I think is kind of being understated or underplayed in a way, is, religion moves people to do great things, and it also moves people to do bad things. And so I think, we just consistently, there's this kind of secular bias that people like Lauren Dawson or Amarasingam have talked about in the context of understanding violent extremism. And I think that we're seeing that again in the analysis and understanding of particularly the sort of more overtly religious manifestations of right-wing extremism. The Christian identity movement was a big thing in the US and in Alberta in the 80s. And that was, whether or not it was historically accurate or not, that was a very genuine belief that, the true Israelites described in the Bible were like Nordic people and like Anglo-Saxons, and that there'd been this great historical theft of their privileged role before God by Jewish folks. And so, if you come to believe that's true, well, all of a sudden, maybe I can start to see why you think engaging in violence is right, because you think there's been this, this cosmic, this spiritual theft that's happened to you. And so it becomes not right, but you start to understand why somebody would take the view that violence is necessary. And I mean, similarly now, how genuine these beliefs are is very much open to debate and interpretation, but we're kind of seeing this spike in, kind of some of the Satanist influences on, some of the groups like Atomwaffen and some of the groups like the Base. And so again, I'm not a scholar of religion, and so I'm not going to dive into I don't know the nuances of Satanism. But again, I think if people can genuinely and sincerely hold Satanist views, and if your Satanist views, as you interpret them, prescribe you to do certain things, well, if you think that your eternal life and you think that, your ascension to eternity or your ascension to the next dimension or whatever is implicated in you doing or not doing something, I start to understand why you might do that. I don't know if that's an answer or further complication. But.
No, that's a great point too, because it kind of makes me think of what I was reading last night, sort of out of my professor's book, but he was interviewing someone who I think is a member of the Muslim community in Toronto. And they were just saying that, when a white person commits a violent act, it's just viewed as this sort of instantaneous violence. And his religious community, like the Christian or evangelical community, never gets blamed for it, right? While if someone of a Muslim background commits an attack, then the entirety of the religion, of course, is blamed for it. So I'm kind of curious now that I think we're starting to understand the, I guess, sort of some of the Christian ties towards right-wing extremism, if we're going to start, I guess, being more cognizant of how certain sects of Christianity are driving that.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's definitely, I'll talk about the Atlanta shooter in this context too. But going back to the Poway synagogue attack, where Joshua Earnest was this very kind of involved in his church community, deemed himself to be very religious. And another thing about religiously motivated extremism is I tend to kind of take the view that religiosity matters more than orthodoxy. So it doesn't matter if you actually have beliefs that are in line with kind of orthodox understanding in your religious tradition. It matters a little bit more if you really are influenced and motivated, you understand yourself as the religious person. So Joshua Earnest did. And so I think, his pastor may have written an op-ed in like the Washington Post or something after that event, being like, we should maybe do some soul searching. I think that, the kind of the purity culture intrinsic in a lot of evangelical churches in the United States, particularly Southern US now, should probably be having the same moment kind of in the aftermath of Atlanta. Not that they are, responsible or encourage this, but that, this guy clearly took that kind of purity culture to heart, and it very much shaped his belief system and understanding of the world. And so, part of the coverage of the Atlanta shooting that's kind of confused me is with him, you actually do seem to have a religious motivation. Reading between the lines a little bit of what he said his motivation was, but you actually seem to have a religious motivation for him doing what he did.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think too, like you have the background in researching Telegram too, but there's so many ties on the various neo-Nazi channels, or at least when they were active on Telegram, to it'd be Hitler and Jesus side by side, and just some very strange sort of aspects. And in terms of the Satanist thing too, I remember when the base did their hate camp in Georgia, I think they like sacrificed a goat and like tried drinking its blood or something. Like it was just this really obscure sort of aspects that like you read it and you say, what the hell's going on here, right? But it's funny because exactly what kind of we were talking about earlier is you never draw that sort of religious identity or parallel towards it. So I guess to pivot a little bit, still focus on the subject of right-wing extremism, kind of curious to hear about your insights in sort of recruiting techniques. Because I remember when you were giving a presentation to our class, you showed us these Spotify playlists, right? It's called like Fash Wave. And sort of like these references, or at least the way I view it is they seem to produce their propaganda in the sense of like it's like a video game to sort of entice people to join. And I was reading the other day that there's a neo-Nazi group in the UK that apparently like the leader was 15 years old or something, and they were actively targeting 13-year-olds. So how are these groups sort of adapting to sort of speak to a younger generation?
Yes, I mean, I think that this is kind of another one of these situations where, we're seeing this change now, but the change is not without precedent. So I'll kind of focus on the music, for example. I think it makes a broader point. You think back to the white power scene in the US, basically from, the 1920s through to the 1960s or so. You had a lot of like overtly racist country music written by racists for racists, that kind of thing. Because, that was sort of the music of America at the time, and the music of the sort of subculture they were drawing from. And then, come the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, you saw a bit of a shift in the subculture and, the introduction of metal music. And now, again, you're seeing a kind of change in the subculture and the introduction of this kind of fash wave, sort of synth-heavy electronic music. And so I think, culture is super important for extremist groups to be able to not only, recruit more people, but also ensure that, they are speaking to people in a language or in a mode they understand. And so I think that this is just kind of another example of, how a movement evolves to fit the cultural context that it is kind of into. I think, I'm a little bit too young to kind of have grown up in like the early 90s. But I think there, the kind of the countercultural scene was very much one influenced by metal, and the kind of that look, that kind of skinhead look. And so perhaps it's not surprising that we saw the music and the culture and the kind of the appearance, the aesthetic of extremism take on that tone. And then now, the kind of like the counterculture is a sort of, edgelord like gaming thing. And so we shouldn't be surprised that, the aesthetic of it, the music of it is trying to adapt, shift, and mirror the kind of counterculture in which it can now find its members in.
So we're approaching an hour. So I guess I'll leave with one last question. And you've absolutely killed it today. I mean, you were running the gambit from every left to right. We were asking you 1,000 questions, just rapid fire, and you were answering them really well. Can you list a couple books that you've read that really help sort of influence or provide you with a really good perspective of these extremist movements that you would recommend to the audience?
Great. So off the top of my head, I'll just sort of mention the two that I'm reading right now. So one is Bring the War Home by a University of Chicago sociologist. Whose name is Catherine Blue. It's weird because there's Catherine Blee and Catherine Blue. Both are women who write on the far right in America. Yeah, so Catherine Blue, Bring the War Home. And then this maybe didn't shape my understanding so much, but just a really, really good book. But Thomas Haighammer did this like amazing book, the biography of Abdullah Azzam, who I think is just a fascinating character. And, in some ways, if not the ideological godfather of the kind of modern jihadist movement, certainly the operational godfather of it. So those are two really good books. I think in terms of, authors who kind of shape my thinking, because I have a tendency, a bit of a short attention span, so I read papers, not books. So some of, Paul Gill's writing and Emily Corner's writing on, risk assessment and mental health and terrorism were super influential. Lauren Dawson and Amarasingam, two great Canadians, very influential. And then I think, Ryan Scriven and Barb Perry's writing on the right in Canada has also been quite influential.
Well, we want to thank you for your time today and joining us. It was an extremely insightful conversation. It's always good to get perspectives from people who possess a really in-depth knowledge of the topic, because we can only go so far as students, and I guess as sort of advocates of promoting this conversation more so the public becomes more aware of it. So we want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking time to join us today.
No, thanks so much to all of you. This is a really cool initiative. So
thanks.